is the first traditional story about Marx. He saw that labor produces all wealth in this story, and so he wanted a socialist society where workers would be fairly rewarded for their waged work, where his labor theory of value would really hold. In seeing that profits derive from exploitation, he filled a single hole in the work of classical political economists like Adam Smith and above all David Ricardo, perfecting the system of political economy by acknowledging a fact ideologically inconvenient to them, the real origins of profits. He had a clear solution, tried in practice in the 20th century. Since capitalism is, as we all know, defined above all by the free market, he wanted to replace that chaotic anarchy with the ordered and planned direction of the economy by the state, eliminating exploitation of the proletariat by redistributing resources thoroughly. Virtually everything I've just said, I'm about to argue, is useless as a way of reading Marx. There's a great deal in the traditional story that I haven't covered there, and we might cover it in the discussion. But I want deliberately to leave you with that thought of the economy as the battleground and a binary opposition between the private disorder of capitalism and the structured, governed world of state planners. Okay, what then is the second story? Well, it begins with a few awkward facts. First, Marx actually replied to a critic who lambasted his theory of history. He honors and shames me too much, Marx said, since Marx offered no marche générale, that's his term, no universal law of historical development, no philosophy of history at all. That, and not simply something called idealism, was the Hegelian conception with which he'd broken the attempt to find universal histories. Much later, the French philosopher Louis Althusser suggested that Marx might have had this urge towards worldview building in mind, as well as more immediate controversies, when famously he declared, "As for me, I'm no Marxist." Though sometimes he made claims about the sweep of human history, Marx's focus was on deriving a theory of the strange specificity of modernity, not merely flag-waving for its victims, but attempting a critical social theory that could explain how this thing we call a society has any coherence at all, how it works, and how it might be superseded. That investigation was all the more crucial to Marx because capitalist society was so peculiar and historically unprecedented. The second awkward truth is that despite supposedly being an economic determinist who believed that thing called the economy determines everything, the term the economy doesn't appear once in Marx's whole corpus. It wasn't yet a term in circulation, not with a definite article in our modern usage, the economy. One good way to read Marx's project is as an account of capitalist society that doesn't begin with the economy, but rather explains why others begin there. An account that explains how not markets, those have existed for millennia, but rather the endless compulsion to accumulate more value, whose universal conscription of all of us to its project, we all have to work for wages or run businesses where we're tied into the profits incentive. That universal conscription of all of us to the expansion of value marks the distinctiveness of capital. And Marx wants to explain how that compulsive dynamic of expansion turns so much of our society into this thing called the economy, this domain of prices and wages where everything, including us and our work, is commodified. Think of the difference between a medieval village entertaining itself with music played by villagers or our condition, where music is a commodity, a track to be downloaded. The key thing here is neither markets nor private ownership. At one point, Marx derided a plan for workers' cooperatives, which he said would only turn workers into collective capitalists, still chained to the law of value. The problem is instead the law of value, the very thing that Marx supposedly heralded. In fact, his contribution lay partly in arguing for the historical peculiarity of this relationship between labor and value that classical political economists had all assumed as their starting point. The labor theory of value isn't Marx's, it belongs to Adam Smith and David Ricardo. So many capital reading groups that puzzle over chapter 1 with its categories of value, I think they're reading Marx, are really reading Marx voicing classical political economy. In fact, his contribution lay elsewhere in stressing that only in a society where a few of us have the means for ensuring our own reproduction, where almost none of us have the means to ensure our own reproduction, a plot of land to farm for food, say, only in a society where very few of us have that means can a new commodity become universal. Labor power, our need to sell our own labor for a wage. And in a society ruled by that particular need, the work of hunting and fishing and going down a mine must all suddenly become one thing, abstract labor, so that these forms of work can all be priced against one another on a labor market. More on this and how it might encourage us to see Marx's political project differently in just a moment. But first, I want to stress the last awkward truth for the traditional interpretation of Marx, which is just how much Marx despised the state. Right from his very earliest work as a communist in 1843 and 44, he was interested explicitly in its abolition, Aufhebung, the German term, abolition or overcoming. And from then on all the way through, he distinguished himself from other rival socialists starkly on the basis of this anti-statism of his. The key thing here is to understand not just what, the key thing here is to understand just why Marx saw the supersession of the modern state as part of the supersession of capitalism. If capitalism wasn't just the market or private power, if it was embodied in the valued form, that meant seeing human beings in a radically novel way. For capitalist society, we are not lords or serfs, but abstract individuals, bearers, all of us, of this key commodity labor power that we buy and sell. Once the declaration of any kind of universal humanity has been transformed, so that declaration might once have seemed like a boldly radical egalitarian call in the peasants' revolts in England when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was a gentleman, a call for a kind of equality. Now, the great achievement enmeshed in both the capitalist marketplace and the structures of abstract citizenship under the power and status of the state is to marry individualism. We're all abstract individuals voting in the, a banker and his cleaner both vote in a polling booth. General Motors and the auto worker both come to the marketplace to trade, to buy and sell labor power. You can marry this idea of the abstract individual and hierarchy, because we live in a hierarchical world. So the state doesn't just reproduce capitalist power in myriad ways by its intervention into a nominally separate sphere called the economy. The very impersonal power of the state, of modern bureaucratic states, also represents the kind of subjectivity that defines capitalist society, where you are both individual, you're both an abstract individual and also at the same time a cog in a hierarchical ladder. What then was Marx's sense of an alternative? Volume 1 of Capital is an extraordinary tour through the emergence and decline of this thing we call labor. You can kind of read the book as the unfolding. Althusser, who I mentioned earlier, is very critical of reading it this way. I think there's some interesting reasons, but you could read Volume 1 of Capital as a kind of unfolding of this category, labor. We all become possessors of labor power when peasants were driven off their land and turned forcibly into proletarians. No happy origin story for capitalism there. Previously, as a peasant, you didn't have a sense that you had to sell your labor power all the time. You could feed yourself by farming from your land. And the rise of machinery from chapter 15 of Capital suggests that capitalism is undermining the very stuff that it created, this human laborer. Far from being an aggressive collectivist then, Marx wanted consistently to free up human individuality from its shackles in the capitalist division of labor. He wanted to emancipate people from subjugation to the power of capitalists, states, and their way together of making us as atomized individuals alienated from one another. He thought the proletariat was uniquely positioned to accomplish that, and he thought capital itself had set the process in motion. Now, there are today two dominant traditions for thinking critically about capitalism, and it might help to see how Marx stands opposed to both of them. In one camp, you've got what we might call economism, that tradition which says capitalism is a kind of economy, and there's a science called economics, which can berate capitalism for its economic inefficiencies, for its cycles of boom and bust, for its mass unemployment that it has historically sometimes caused, for its inflation and the difficulties, or deflation and the difficulties they can cause. Now, against that view, you have people who say, well, capitalism actually is an unjust kind of society, and it might be that it produces an alienated, impoverished, spiritually impoverished kind of consumer living, which even if it's making us wealthy and succeeding on economic grounds, is still to be lambasted. So you have economism on the one hand, and on the other hand, what I think of as a kind of moralism that says, I have some moral norm, whether it's some spiritual Christian norm of fellowship or some trans-historical claim about human nature, and capitalism doesn't live up to this moral norm, and so I'm going to attack it on that basis. Marx is doing neither of these two things. The particular tradition of the German philosophical tradition of immanent critique, in which he stands, thinks that critique should work not by taking a standpoint external to the object of its critique. There's this thing called God's divine wisdom, and capitalism doesn't live up to that. But instead by exploding the foundations and their contradictions within the phenomenon you wish to critique. So Marx's position is not to say capitalism is an economy and it's economically inefficient, but to read capitalism as a form of domination and a form of making us as particular kinds of people, which also creates its own grave diggers in the proletariat and creates its own conditions of obsolescence in relying on this thing, human labor, which it then renders obsolescent with the growth of technology. And so capitalism creates its own possibilities for overcoming it. And indeed, we can criticize it, taking as our standpoint for critique the very possibility that capitalism creates and then that capitalism curtails and refuses to allow to be realized. So that's my whistle-stop tour, and I know that it was absurdly whistle-stop, and I hope we'll have lots to talk about. I've tried here to present only the very brief beginnings of an argument so that I don't take up too much discussion time. But before finishing, I want to say just something about this present moment, the global pandemic. The traditional view of Marx might lead us in one direction. On the left, in much of the world, we have sadly been forced to get good at arguing against the devastation wrought by austerity. We have then been the defenders of state provision against its free market enemies, and that was very important. Today, with states propping up levels of economic activity unprecedented in peacetime, it's therefore been tempting for socialists to announce a kind of covert victory. I think that would be deeply misguided. I think our enemy is not just material inequality, but social domination, which is poverty's real cause. That is part of Marx's insight. And state power is rarely our friend. And that's especially important today, since we may be living through the end of a neoliberal era when anti-statism was the proclaimed particular rallying cry of the right. You know, some of the great gods of the birth of the neoliberal era involved the aggressive use of monetary policy, for example, to control inflation. Well, today, central bankers say they're no longer worried about inflation. Democratic money is bad money was one of the great claims of the founding fathers of neoliberalism, and today they're calling for very active state intervention in monetary policy. The very sort of god of central bank independence is coming into question. And if in 2008, unnoticed by including much of the left, there was an enormous transnational coordination among central bankers as well as politicians to ensure the stability of the architecture of global finance, today, that same kind of extraordinary coordination has been present in terms of fighting poverty, even though we can criticize its great inadequacies all over the world, and we ought to do so. So I think it can help us in our moment to have a picture of Marx as someone who's able to be critical of the kinds of domination under which we live, and not just the power of free markets calling for the state to come in and intervening against them. So I hope that the Marx that I've presented might be politically helpful and useful. It might also seem strange, and I might also have been a little too confident in running through such material so quickly. So I hope we can talk about it. But I hope it's been of interest. Someone in the chat says, would you call Marx a revolutionary, even if a moderate or a liberal one? I certainly think of him as a revolutionary, and certainly not a moderate or a liberal one. In fact, part of the reading that I'm giving you is to say Marx has been thought much more moderate than he really was. It's been thought that he was like those socialists he attacked, like Ferdinand Lassalle, for example, calling for state intervention in this thing called the economy, or perhaps like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, another socialist he attacked, calling for workers to set up some cooperatives. In fact, he was calling not just to change the way that we distribute commodities, but for a transformation which he thought capitalism was making possible in the mode of production beyond the kind of industrial societies that, you know, the 20th century had, whether in the USA or the Soviet Union, beyond wage labor itself. And also, I think, and this is, you know, that's something that's been said by some critics, but I think he was also challenging the very production of particular kinds of people by capitalist society, this abstract but also hierarchical individuality. So rather than just saying I champion labor against capital, he was seeing how both labor and capital are produced. Abstract labor is itself, and the condition of the worker is produced by a particular kind of capitalist society. So his critique of capitalism, I think, is really remarkably revolutionary, you know, more radical than has often been appreciated. But anyway, and he was also a revolutionary in the traditional political sense, again, underappreciated, that he loathed existing political power, and he wanted to overcome it, and he didn't just celebrate it against economic power. Okay, that's my spiel on that. So 3 great questions. First, on this question of democracy, you know, I'm delighted that you draw the distinction between modern representative democracy and something more participatory and radical. Marx was especially enthused by the Paris Commune in 1871. He said, finally, the proletariat has worked out the political form through which its economic emancipation might be realized. This was a commune that didn't socialize all property or expropriate the expropriators, as Marx had called for, but it did do things like make all office holders accountable so they could be recalled at any time and pay only a worker's wage to its office holders. It was a radically more democratic structure than the kinds of democracy that we know, or the things that we call democracy, which actually many of the kind of classical theorists of democracy wouldn't have called democracy at all, would have called forms of oligarchy. The important thing there is that Marx recognized some radical conception of democracy as important for being empowering, because so much of his politics was about empowering people, not simply, as I was saying, redistributing material resources to make people more economically equal. That was crucial, but he saw empowerment as part of the roots to doing that. Part of the basis for poverty was the different levels of power that people have in society. I do want to say, though, that radical conception of democracy isn't the whole story. Oscar Wilde famously said the problem with socialism was that it would take up too many evenings, which is a conception utterly alien to any citizen of a Stalinist state, where you weren't going to endless meetings every evening to decide the distribution of resources. That was done by an unaccountable central planning board. So you can see how much changed in the view of socialism. But I also think it's a view of socialism slightly alien to Marx's, because he doesn't just want to wield politics, our active, democratic, constant participation against and over this thing called the economy. I think he imagines a different order, a different kind of hierarchy of power and status, or really no hierarchy of power and status, so that we are produced as different kinds of people beyond the constructions of the marketplace and the state. So it isn't just a constant active participation, kind of, we've always got to be careful, or organically free markets and their order will re-emerge. So we have to sort of clamp down on them all the time with endless meetings. And call it radical democracy. He actually thought that capitalism was making possible more organically a different kind of order of social relations. This is something I'm thinking about now, and exactly how to answer it, I'm not sure. I'm kind of writing about this for my PhD. So there's some very partial thoughts. Then the second question was a great chance for me to come back on some of these traditional readings of Marx, especially as concerns dialectics. You see, I think that Marx's relationship to Hegel was not at all a question of turning him on his head by taking an idealist and making him a materialist. I mean, in the introduction to Volume 1 of Capital, you can see Marx grappling with the defense of Hegel against those political economists who think, why on earth is this guy talking in this language of Hegel? And he says he needs to rescue the dead dog, partly because he's come to see that something very abstract and a real abstraction, value, has come to structure the whole story he wants to tell about capitalism. It's not just a material story of different classes facing off against each other. There's this abstraction value that functions a bit like spirit does in Hegel as the kind of guiding subject of the story. He even uses the Hegelian term, the dominant subject, to describe capital at one point in the book. I think then that possibly his relationship to Hegel is something more like taking a process that Hegel thought to be a universal law of all phenomena in the world, as the questioner put it, and instead showing how it might in fact be that Hegel's describing a very specific set of processes specific to capitalist society. For example, this kind of logic of endless progress, right, which is the logic of the value form and its endless expansion. And so Marx is taking a supposedly universal picture and grounding it instead as the symptom, the ideological symptom of a particular kind of society. So I have a different view about the place of dialectics in Marx and his relationship to Hegel. It could take up lots of discussion, but I just wanted to pull up one other thing from that question. I agree with what the questioner said about universal. Well, a couple of other things. I agree with what that questioner said about universal commodification as a feature of capitalist society. But I think we have to be careful here. We have from George Lukács, the great Hungarian Marxist, this analysis about reification as the dynamic of a capitalist society, turning everything into a thing. But lots of later feminist work, for example, has been about, in the Marxist tradition, has been about stressing that in fact capital might rely on not commodifying lots of things. So that, for example, the socially reproductive labor that traditionally women do in the household isn't paid a wage and commodified. It is in fact kept separate, and so that capital can expropriate it for free. Ecological criticism has spoken recently, people like Jason Moore have spoken recently about how capital treats nature in the same way, something that it can expropriate for free. Slavery obviously involved the expropriation of massive amounts of labor power without paying wages to them, though human beings were commodities. And then just lastly on that questioner raised this Engels' discussion in Anti-Düring, sort of published in English excerpted version of this text called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, of monopoly. And I definitely want to come back on this because it's very important in that passage that you mentioned that Engels wants to differentiate socialism from nationalization, right? He wants to say the concentration of capitalists, so that rather than having lots of small competitive greengrocers, you've got what we now call Tesco, or Walmart. That process does, it's right, make capital ripe for a kind of expropriation. But that isn't the victory. Concentration and concentrated power is not our victory. And so the state just nationalizing things and expressing this kind of remote state power over things is not our victory. Marx has a very similar discussion in volume 3 of Capital, where he talks about the joint stock company as a kind of transitional form where you no longer have an individual capitalist controlling lots of workers, but instead he says capital is kind of expropriating capitalists itself and replacing all these individual capitalists with boards of shareholders. So Marx is already alive to that phenomenon that we now treat as much more a 20th century phenomenon, but he doesn't regard these forms of concentration and monopoly power and cartelization, or for that matter, the state doing it in nationalization. He doesn't regard that as the victory, right? The task is rather to end the forms of domination reflected in both state control over these things and private control over these things. And then one brief comment on Willem's question about unions, which is just to say, part of the virtue of this approach that I have to Marx, I think, is in thinking about what unions are, because beyond a kind of economistic view in which unions only exist to get more pay for their members, for example, or to protect their members' jobs, unions might be a kind of shell of a future society if they work as empowering places against the miserable alienated logic of the value form, spaces where people come together to collectively to reclaim an identity and a sense of ownership over their future, which the workplace and the boss would organically deny them. And so in that case, obviously unions being entangled with state apparatuses is as damaging as unions being entangled with bosses in corporatist models, where in either case they serve simply to manage the labor force. One of the great criticisms that the left in Britain made in the 1970s, for example, was that the social contract, which made union bosses responsible for administering pay deals, turned unions into arms of the state. And that actually has been a much more general process that is, I think, the death blow to what unions could be and to their radical or even revolutionary potential. Okay, another round of questions. Okay, so I'll take Boyd and Dan together. Absolutely, Dan's absolutely right about the critique of the Gotha program. I'll take them together because they're both questions about the state, and they fit together quite nicely. Because Boyd asks, "Don't we need the state? Why do we have someone telling us that that the state should go away? Doesn't that sound like right-wing ideology? Isn't that what neoliberals claim and what the makers of austerity claim? And don't we need a state to support us?" Well, in a class society, the state might appear as one democratic mechanism for lessening the awful weight of private power. And indeed, the anti-statism of the right is very different, obviously, from Marx's anti-statism, because it wants to enshrine forms of private power from any protection by the demos, from any protection by any collective form of power. And in systems of universal suffrage, which post-dated Marx, the state might be one kind of vehicle through which to hold private power to account. Indeed, Marx was very enthusiastic about the Chartists fighting for universal suffrage in Britain when he was living in Britain, and he said that winning the political supremacy of the working class through mass suffrage was the kind of first step on the road to socialism. But Marx was very skeptical that a state in a class society ever really could be this kind of properly democratic mechanism. That social democrats, for example, might imagine it can be this tool for the demos to wield against power. Because Marx didn't think the state stood separately from society in a kind of neutral position. Marx had a conception of a social totality in which the state is part of the hierarchies that govern us. And so capitalist power affects what kind of thing the state is. And what I was trying to argue is it doesn't just affect it doesn't just mean that capitalists from outside can lobby the state to do what they want, or that capitalists from within can take up lots of positions in the state. How many senior civil servants went to an narrow range of schools. But also the kind of very form of the modern state I was trying to argue, I think reflects something that troubles Marx. In a classless society, that function, the need for any kind of collective antidote to private power, whatever you think of the state today and whether it can be that thing, in a classless society, that function obviously disappeared. And that's the kind of society Marx wanted, a society beyond the expression of power and domination, either by a private individual capitalist or by an impersonal law of the marketplace compelling us all to produce ever more each year, or by the impersonal bureaucracy of the state or the personal power of a president. Right? All of these are forms of power wielded by some people over others that Marx wants to supersede. Indeed, the etymological origin of the state is the same as the origin of status, right? A standing over others. And that's the kind of thing that I think Marx wants to get beyond. Now, Dan is absolutely right, though, that Marx isn't an anarchist, and he sees a need for concentrated state power in a transitional period in order to get a classless society. The day after a revolution is not the beginning of a classless society. Classes still exist, just as they did the day before. And as Dan hints, Marx kind of stands between these two rival socialists, Ferdinand Lassalle and Mikhail Bakunin. Lassalle, who thought the state was marvelous, and Bakunin, who wanted to oppose it and abolish it on day one. I think part of the sort of similarity between Lassalle and Bakunin that Marx sees is that they're both sort of obsessed with the state as a form of political domination, and they don't see it as merely reflecting broader norms of social domination. Lassalle thinks it's great that it's a form of political power. Bakunin thinks it's awful. But they're unable, in other words, to locate the state within the social totality as one form of power, which is also reflected in the capitalist marketplace. So you're quite right, Dan, about the critique of the Gotha program, but it's worth bearing in mind, if you read Marx's critical notes on Bakunin, that's find these online these days. Marx wrote sort of marginalia notes on Bakunin's statism and anarchy. And he has these little notes there where he talks about what kind of state he means in that transitional period. And he has Bakunin saying to him, will this state really be the full expression of millions of Germans rather than just some bureaucratic body wielded over them? And Marx says, of course it will be, because it starts with the commune in every area. So even in that transitional period, it's a conception of the state as radically more democratic. He was impressed by the Paris Commune, radically more democratic than the kind of state either which is known to us or which in the 20th century might often have taken Marx's name. So that brings me to the other question about some real world examples. There are, of course, lots of experiments in an empowering conception of socialism. You mentioned Rojava and Chiapas, but also the early stages of the Bolshevik Revolution, where Soviets were imagined as much more empowering democratic arms of power than parliaments. And so Lenin's slogan wasn't just material equality, but it was all power to the Soviets. Of course, that kind of empowering socialism didn't last long in Russia under enormous pressure and isolation. But it is to ask for Marx, who thinks that capitalism is making possible the historical conditions for its own supersession, to ask in the moment of capitalism's development what a future society might be like is a bit like asking a medieval peasant to imagine Facebook, right? I mean, we're talking about, in terms of a stateless, classless, communist society, about a radically different world, though Marx doesn't think it's radically different in the sense of just having to pop out of a plane from nowhere or something. He thinks that the preconditions for it are established in the present. And so I often remember a little poem by Bertolt Brecht about the Tailor of Ulm, a classic folk story about a tailor who had these crazy dreams. He thought he could fly. And so he went to the top of a church tower, jumped off with the wings he'd made, fell to the ground, and the priest looked at him and said, as he lay there dead on the ground, you see, human beings will never fly. That was in the 15th century. Now, of course, we know differently. We get in airplanes all the time. So it's important to Marx that capital is establishing historical preconditions for a kind of future which wasn't possible previously and which now is easily deemed still as being utterly impossible. Okay, more questions. Those are fantastic questions. Firstly, on the Soviet Union, one of the most, I'm about to teach a class. I teach at this thing, the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, and I'm about to teach a class on Lenin, which I would welcome anyone to sign up for and join. It's how I pay my rent. So I hope you'll excuse the exorbitant fees. So it's also, you know, pay what you can. And one of the really tragic and tough things to read in preparing that class is Lenin's very final writings around the time of his stroke, just before his stroke, in 1923-4. They have a tragic note as Lenin grapples with the rise of a new kind of bureaucracy, having battled himself to overthrow an old authoritarian Tsarist bureaucracy. And there's a beautiful book, classic book by Moshe Lewin called Lenin's Last Struggle about this. So Lenin was himself aware, and this is forgotten by pictures, traditional pictures of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the vanguard party, which are taken to be monolithic, authoritarian, dictatorial blocs. Lenin was deeply enmeshed in this kind of older language of socialism as freedom, and the attempt in the Russian Revolution to craft a new kind of freedom. One of the texts that is often taken, his text on the immediate construction, the immediate problems of the construction of socialism, often taken as a place where he defends brutal dictatorship. It's striking that in all the paragraphs that get quoted, where Lenin says we need iron will, he's talking about an exigent moment of fighting a war where they're surrounded on all sides by enemies. But he immediately follows it by saying, and this iron will be useless unless it's supported by the active participation of workers and peasants and soldiers in the dictatorship, which will be their dictatorship, not a dictatorship over them, but a dictatorship of them against a tiny minority of exploiters. So he had this ambitious conception and was aware at the end of his life that it had been completely shut down. Now, I don't mean to say that I think he was guilt-free in the shutting down of that. And another, you know, if Moshe Lewin has this very sympathetic text on Lenin's last struggle, people should also read great libertarian socialist in British tradition, Maurice Brinton or Chris Pallas, the same person, who has this, I've forgotten what it's called now, but has a beautiful book on the, I think it's called The Bolsheviks and Workers' Control, about how Lenin and the Bolshevik leaders played a role in shutting down those free Soviets. Under conditions of great exigency, they thought. So I think what we have to do is to get beyond a kind of moralism, which thinks that the problem is the individual failures of some bad people, idiots who misread and misunderstood Marx and didn't put him into practice properly, or evil people who seized the reins of power and corrupted everything, which could sometimes, for example, be the language of Trotskyism in talking about Stalin, though actually, interestingly, it's not Trotsky's language in the Revolution Betrayed at all. He has a much more Marxist language, which is to try to think about under what material conditions that degeneration of the revolution happened, right? It was very difficult to abolish power and status and have freedom for all in conditions of poverty and war, and in which a revolution was surrounded and embattled from the start. And a new bureaucratic class arose to govern the country in the process of that revolution. These are, of course, fundamental challenges for us. The lesson really is that we should have had a discussion about the politics of technology and the problems of technological determinism, which appears sometimes on the left. I'm so sorry for my useless technology. And I'm especially sorry to the poor person who has to edit this video and edit out all of these slips. I was saying that, of course, to raise this problem of the degeneration of the Russian Revolution is not just a historical problem. It's a problem for anyone who thinks that any kind of revolutionary process would face all sorts of very deep challenges. And as I think it was Dan was talking earlier about Marx's sensitivity to this problem in the critique of the Gotha program, one of the reasons that he's not an anarchist is because he knows that the exercise of various forms of power, nasty though it may be, is a necessary part of any transitional process to extinguish the power. The way that Lenin talks about it is the power of the majority wielded against the power of a tiny minority who want to prevent freedom. But I was saying, I think we need accounts of this process of degeneration that aren't just about the failings of individual leaders. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, a strangely kind of orthodox and heterodox Marxist, Jerry Cohen, produced an account that stressed, and I think this became quite common, stressed how unusual, of course, the Russian Revolution would have seemed on Marx's schema. Jerry Cohen wasn't the first person to say this. Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist, wrote an article after the Bolshevik Revolution called "The Revolution Against Das Kapital," against Marx's capital. Because if Marx had had a sense of immanent critique in which capitalist society as it developed produced the conditions for its own overcoming, he expected revolution to take place in conditions of highly developed capitalism, not backward as he would have seen it, and feudal and rural Russia, 95% of whose population was peasants, not industrial workers. So the enormous difficulties of the Russian Revolution, on Cohen's view and on the view of lots of classic Second International Marxists at the turn of the 20th century, were kind of written in from the start. How we navigate that process of difficulty is a big political question. I'd love to say more about it, but I want to rush through the other questions before we have to go. So I just want to quickly sort of bang one cliche on the head. It's often said, and someone said it just now, that Marx wrote very little about the future. He was engaged in a critique of capitalism, but not in thinking about the end of capitalism. Well, it's true that Marx famously said he wasn't going to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. He didn't. He had various interesting reasons for skepticism about utopian kinds of socialist thinking. But there's an important difference between utopia and transition, right? Between a picture of a perfect society long in the future and a picture of the dynamics through which capital will be ended. And I actually think that that claim, that interest, undergirds all of Marx's writing after, say, 1844, 1845. Right the way through to the end. And you see it, for example, in the fact that the penultimate chapter of Volume 1 of Capital is indeed about the process of the end of capitalist society. So I think that and Marx's whole interest in the proletariat as the class which he thinks will end capitalist society. So I don't think he's uninterested in the end of capitalism at all. But I entirely agree, and I think it's kind of the point I'm trying to hammer away at from that questioner who said that the collapse of social democracy on one hand and Stalinism on the other leaves us kind of bereft on the left without an ideological framework. And what I've been trying to suggest, lots of other people making contributions to this, is to say that recovering Marx as a critic of labor, as abstract labor, as the oppressive creation of capitalist society, Marx as some kind of what we might call now a post-work thinker, and also recovering Marx as a critic of the state. In other words, these two things which are taken to define him in the 20th century, the support for various kinds of state power and the support for various kinds of industrial production. You know, the Soviet Union was above all a kind of Fordist society, an industrial society. Seeing Marx as a critic of those two things, I think can help us to begin to chart some of the contours for our own politics today, understanding that our world is radically different from Marx's in all kinds of ways. Indeed, I think part of the reason that these strange readings of Marx took hold was because they made sense as responses to the particular conditions of the 20th century. So I think that Marx could offer us some help there, though this call has been fantastic in people raising rightly the fact that that's just all I was trying to do, is just to set out some very first principles that then immediately become tangled in great difficulty. You know, what on earth does it mean to supersede wage labor? What on earth does it mean in practice really to supersede state power? These really are questions that I've been raising much more than answers. Very important person who said they've been reading John Bellamy Foster. And what does Marx have to say about ecology? Well, there's currently a big spate of books and work being done on this. Bellamy Foster's very interested in what he calls the metabolic rift that Marx identifies between human beings and the natural world. Kohei Saito has a book very similar to Bellamy Foster's stuff called Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, which people should read. And Andreas Malm's stuff is also worth reading, as is Jason Moore. So there's lots of thinking going on about this. And one thing that this thinking kind of stresses is that where it's become fashionable today to talk about the Anthropocene, right? The idea that the distinctive thing about our world is that human beings can remold the natural environment. In fact, it would be better, you know, we're no longer just prisoners of storms, we're actually creating storms. It would be better to talk not of the Anthropocene as if all human beings are jointly responsible for this condition, but for something like the Capitalocene. It's capital that's doing this. Of course, we know a tiny number of corporations are responsible for 70% of global pollution in recent years, but it's not just about the individual power of corporations. It's about the idea that it is the value form, it is the constant imperative always to produce more and more and more value, which of course is incompatible with finite living on a finite planet. And so that is, of course, the basis for socialist critique of ecological questions and of a Marxist ecology, which says the value form is increasingly obsolescent, both, as I stress, because it is all about human labor in a world in which technology and automation are rendering that less and less central in our lives, and also because it is in very uneven ways and in ways often subject to kind of silly celebration and exaggerated claims. So it's worth being careful about that. But equally, the endless expansion of value and the endless expansion of GDP growth are challenged by the fact of our finite planet and the enormous damage that they're wreaking on the planet. So that would be a great note to end on, but I must say something about William Morris. I should say the person who says, what should they read on Marx? The literature is so voluminous that I can only say that you should message me separately about the particular questions that interest you, and I'll give recommendations, because where to start with Marx himself is is almost impossible. But someone asked me about, I think the same person asked me about William Morris, and William Morris is wonderful, and people should read News from Nowhere. And it's a great example, actually, of libertarian anti-statist Marxism. There's a scene in News from Nowhere, William Morris's utopian text, where he's a traveler who's propelled forward into the future, a socialist future. And he says, well, not everything's changed, because I'm looking over the River Thames in this socialist future, and I see the Houses of Parliament. You've still got the Houses of Parliament in your socialist society, says William Morris's traveller. And his guide, his citizen of a socialist future, turns back to him and says, I shouldn't say citizen, citizenship's gone. They're free members of a community. Turns back to him and says, yes, we've still got the Houses of Parliament. We need it. We use it to store horse manure. So there is a guide to a post-capitalist future. I don't say that meaning any insult to the marvelous socialist Labour MPs who do excellent work now, but their work is transitional, and we hope for a world without the state and without wage labour and without capital. Three more brilliant questions. I'll take Paul's first, because Marx is not a Hobbesian. So it's I'm really glad that you bring Hobbes up, because Marx doesn't have Hobbes's pessimism. You know, Hobbes belongs to a long tradition of thinking that in the Jewish tradition, we have in Pirkei Avot, a Jewish text, that the claim that men would eat themselves alive if it weren't for the power of various kinds of governing authorities. Marx comes instead from that much more optimistic tradition reflected in Rousseau, for example, that thinks that it's particular kinds of nasty, brutish, hierarchical social conditions that produce the need for power to keep us in check. You know, the problem Marx thought with saying property is theft is because the very concept of theft requires the idea of private property. It's only in a regime in which some have and others don't that you have, you know, people stealing from others in order to feed themselves. So Marx saw the state not as the product of human nature, which would be the pessimistic view that Hobbes has, but instead as being the product of particular kinds of social conditions. And so if those social conditions are radically different, then the need for forms of power that we now experience and internalize and essentialize as simply necessary to what it is to be human might in fact fade away, just as for Hobbes it was necessary that that sovereign had to be an individual, a single individual like a king, and he couldn't imagine a kind of democratic sovereignty of the form that we have. Also importantly different, of course, Hobbes does think of the sovereign as a kind of fictional person, and this is why for some later Hobbesians, maybe it could be a demos. There are places in Hobbes's text where he suggests it could be. It's a kind of fictional person, utterly outside society, this state onto which we project our need for protection. Marx doesn't see the state as so radically separate from the hierarchies of society. He sees it as enmeshed in them and as reflecting them. So what I've tried to do in the talk today is to give you one quite particular and assertive presentation of some things in Marx that I hope are surprising, and it's deliberately designed to be provocative, in the hope that there will be some things there that people can chew over and perhaps strongly disagree with, but that we can return to Marx, as I said, 3 decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, and try to explore different notes that we find in his texts, and not just the things that are familiar to us as readers of Marx and have been familiar to readers of Marx for a long time. And that's one of the reasons that I stress this relationship to the state. To take Pete's question and Daisy's together, are great and important questions, because obviously linked. Pete asked how we can challenge the 1% today, and Daisy gives us this very moving understanding of the bitter and tough struggles of being a key worker, suddenly recognized as a key worker when previously often key workers were demeaned as unskilled, especially when they were migrants, and the challenges of trying to cope with weekly applause from Tory politicians, but the denial of a pay rise, and knowing that the conditions, though they're celebrated as heroic,
under which key workers work and under which people in the NHS work are not eased, even though it would be within the ambit of government policy to ease them somewhat if they really wanted to. I think we should be critical of the whole language of heroism, which accompanies refugees too, for example, when people celebrate the resilience of refugees. It's a kind of language, a kind of alibi to which a society that has made conditions very difficult then lauds and applauds the people who manage to struggle even in those difficult conditions. Of course, the radical thing, Marx said, to be radical is etymologically to get at the root. The radical thing to say is not, are NHS workers doing a marvelous job? We know they are, but what are the conditions under which their jobs have been made so difficult, and how can we change those conditions? And the picture I've tried to present is really all about understanding that Marx isn't just about redistributing some wealth. So he's not just about the view, though it's crucially necessary, that, say, people in the NHS deserve a pay rise. He's also about seeing how the demeaning, humiliating effects of disempowerment in our society scar us all, because we are all subject to the arbitrary power of bosses and politicians and to the impersonal power of bureaucracies and of the marketplace. And it was indeed Labour's 1974 manifesto, that once its most radical ever manifesto, perhaps in modern post-war times, that called for a fundamental and irreversible shift of wealth and power towards working people and their families. And I think as we come out of the pandemic, one of the things to consider is not just a demand for a rebalancing of economic priorities, because capitalists might decide that it's popular and they can't avoid it now to fund the NHS a bit more, for example. But it's to ask more fundamental questions about whether it should really be in the hands of a few politicians and capitalists to control how our health and our safety and our welfare are regulated, or whether we all should be in control of that collectively, whether the kinds of people who today work in the NHS shouldn't simply work in it and fight for a decent pay package and fight for proper safety regulations and fight for proper masks so they can go about their jobs safely, but should also be the kinds of people, this is Marx's dream, who run the world, so that our key workers don't just run the world in terms of doing all the work that keeps it ticking, but also run the world in terms of being empowered to control its direction. That's the future that was often forgotten, the empowering, emancipatory future that I think Marx represents. And in these moments where I take inspiration not from government spending packages, but from mutual aid groups through which people have taken charge of their own destinies, of course, in highly limited and fractured ways, because mutual aid under capitalism is pretty hard to distinguish, though we might try, from acts of individual charity. But it is the seed of a future in which we run our lives together, determine our destinies, and are no longer subject to powers wholly external to us and which care very little about us.